I am very excited to welcome our next speaker, a good friend of Realize, Julia McEathron. Julia will be speaking on Indigenous understandings of episodic disability at work. Julia is the National Coordinator of Indigenous Disability Canada / the BC Aboriginal Network on Disability Society. These organizations are award-winning Indigenous nonprofits that advance the unique disability needs and priorities of Indigenous peoples, families, and communities. As National Coordinator, Julia oversees various organizational capacity, awareness, and engagement activities related to Indigenous disability. As a proud Algonquin-Anishinaabe and mixed settler woman with a strong professional background and lived experiences of disability, Julia is committed to truth and reconciliation and honoring her ancestors by advancing the priority of Indigenous disability within Canada. Julia is grateful to reside on the unceded, unsurrendered traditional territory of the Algonquin-Anishinaabe Peoples in Ottawa, Ontario. I will hand it over to you, Julia. Nice to see you. Oh, Julia, we can't hear you.
How about now, Melissa?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. You know what? My headphones have been giving me some issues lately, so my apologies for that.
No problem at all.
Miigwech, Melissa, thank you very much for that introduction. I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen, and then we can get started. Okay. Can I get a thumbs up, Melissa, if you can see
It
my
looks
screen
good.
there?
Yep, it's
Okay,
perfect.
fantastic. Thank you so much. Kweani, Julia Andishnakash, Omami Wanini, Marauskarini, Anishinaabe Kweyandao, Whitney Nindonjaba, Makwa Nindota. Hello, everyone. Bonjour. My name is Julia McEathron. I am an Algonquin-Anishinaabe and mixed settler woman from the Madawaska Valley. I am a member of the Whitney and area Algonquin First Nation, and Whitney is where I called home, and Bear is my clan. As Melissa mentioned, I am sitting here in my office on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin-Anishinaabe Peoples, known colonially and presently as Ottawa, Ontario. For a visual description, I am a fair-skinned woman. I've got long brown hair. I'm wearing black glasses and a white cardigan, and I am sitting in my office with some plants behind me today. As Melissa mentioned, I'm the National Coordinator of Indigenous Disability Canada and the BC Aboriginal Network on Disability Society. For the purpose of today's presentation, I'll just use the abbreviation of IDC and BCANDS to save a little bit of time, as it's a bit of a mouthful. And in my job as National Coordinator, I oversee various organizational capacity, engagement, and awareness initiatives in relation to Indigenous disability. But on a more personal note, why I am incredibly passionate about the work that I do and the work that we do as an organization is my background in communications and public relations, and my strong desire to bring disability and reconciliation to the forefront of Canada between Indigenous and non-Indigenous persons living in Canada and persons with disabilities. As Melissa also mentioned, and as some of you probably know on this call, IDC and BCANDS is an internationally recognized non-for-profit disability Indigenous organization that's dedicated to serving Indigenous individuals with disabilities, their families, and their communities. Since 1991, we've provided a vast array of disability-related programs and services to Indigenous peoples with disabilities across Canada, both within First Nations communities, in urban and in rural settings as well. In addition to that, IDC and BCANS hold special consultative status with the United Nations Economic and Social Council, and we're the leading organization in Canada that monitors Canada's implementation of the CRPD, or the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. If my math is correct, I think this year marks 34 years of our organization successfully delivering disability and health programs and services across Canada, which is very exciting. So I I won't go into this slide in exhaustive detail. For those listening in, I've put an inexhaustive list of services up on the slide deck here. What I do want to share is that if anyone on this call is an Indigenous person living with a disability, if you know of an Indigenous person living with a disability and would like more information or access supports, or if you're a organization or a employer looking for Indigenous disability information, we may be able to assist you, and I would encourage you to reach out to us after this presentation. Additionally, we're engaging Indigenous and non-Indigenous persons with disabilities, communities, and organizations to identify the barriers that they experience in obtaining employment. This data is being collected and will be shared with governments to raise awareness, suggest solutions, and hopefully for the potential creation of new policies and changes within resources. So the why is probably the most common question that I get asked within my line of work. And it's also my favorite question to answer. Why Indigenous disability? Why not disability in general? Like, why do we care so much about this intersection within disability? And why should anyone care? Why should you care? To that, I would say that the reality is that Indigenous peoples living in Canada experience a disability rate that is much higher than that of the non-Indigenous population. Currently, there are over 1.8 million people in Canada who identify as Indigenous. And by that, I mean status or non-status First Nation, Métis, and or Inuit. And out of that 1.8 million, approximately 30 to 35% of Indigenous peoples identify as living with a disability, or over 1 in 3 Indigenous peoples living within Canada identify as having a disability, which is a huge, huge number. And again, I say approximately because the data isn't accurately representative, be it that the data only looks at a certain age category. And as we know, folks tend to not self-identify as having a disability for a multitude of reasons. Specifically, we find within our communities that we interact with, we hear that disability is a Western concept. There's harmful societal perceptions, and there are harmful colonial practices. For example, the forced sterilization of Indigenous women who had a disability, or children being taken away from parents who were deemed as unfit parents to their disability. Speaking of women, we see higher rates of disability with Indigenous and non-Indigenous women, opposed to Indigenous and non-Indigenous men in Canada as well. And additionally, Indigenous peoples are likely to experience episodic disabilities as they often face mental health issues of varying severity. This is led to disturbing rates, unfortunately, of suicide, depression, anxiety, and other mental health challenges, and ongoing racism, discrimination, poor living conditions, and the lasting impact of colonialism continues to harm our communities to this day. So, in addition to high rates of anti-Indigenous racism and disability discrimination, Indigenous peoples with disabilities face unique barriers due to their dual identities. Some of these barriers can include, but are certainly not limited to, high rates of poverty and homelessness, high rates of unemployment and incarceration. We unfortunately have a missing and murdered Indigenous women and Two-Spirit peoples, and those with disabilities, and issues faced specifically to living within a First Nations community. So that's anything from clean water advisories, limited job opportunities, and limited economic development, and issues specifically with the built environment. So thinking about infrastructure that is in need of great repair and is not accessible to community members living with disabilities. So all that to say, back to my favorite question, why do we care and why do I think you should all care? Well, Indigenous disability in Canada remains a low priority despite the significant rates of disability and barriers faced that I've communicated. But I do want to highlight, despite these barriers, Indigenous peoples with disabilities demonstrate remarkable resilience. Unfortunately, this marginalized group already faces barriers and challenges due to their cultural identity. And then being disabled adds another layer of complexity. And unfortunately, this lack of priority with government and Canadians, and this lack of understanding equates to a lack of meaningful change, which is something that we're trying to change within our organization. I want to shift gears slightly and approach this discussion differently, because I find that sometimes stats and numbers don't fully capture the true experiences and stories of Indigenous peoples with disabilities. And we know as an organization and we as a person, I know that disability can and is viewed and experienced differently by Indigenous peoples. So for example, through teachings, research, and connecting with Indigenous peoples with disabilities across Turtle Island, we've learned that disability is a colonial construct. There's no one word translation for disability in Indigenous languages. Although disabilities certainly existed pre-contact and now in communities, they certainly weren't defined like they are today. So whereas in today's landscape, disability, as we know, is strictly defined, and it's defined often by able-bodied policymakers, and it's non-inclusive, and it's harmful to people who don't fit the boxes within the definition. So I'm thinking especially for people with episodic disabilities whose disability varies from day to day. So one day someone might fit the description of being disabled, and on another day they may present as a completely able-bodied person. So if you don't fit the description, you don't get the support. So for example, episodic disability, a legitimate disability, but persons living with these conditions are often excluded from accessing these supports as they're not disabled enough and don't fit the definition. The disability tax credit comes to my mind as an example. And thinking about the term not disabled enough, Like it's almost like there's a hierarchy of disability, which I imagine in part has something to do with how disability is defined in today's landscape. Um, Moving on from a traditional Indigenous perspective, disability was and is not regarded as a burden or a source of shame. It's seen as a gift from the Creator. Individuals with disabilities aren't ostracized in their communities. Instead, they contribute uniquely within their capabilities, enhance the community, and pave the way for future generations. So on the left-hand side or through my speech, we see lots of positive connotations and discourse surrounding views. On the flip side, I won't give examples and make space for negative connotations and stereotypes that harm Indigenous peoples with disabilities, because, well, obviously, yes, they're out there, and I'm sure we all know what they are and can think of examples. In today's world, under colonial influence, community support varies for persons with disabilities and Indigenous persons with disabilities. So although a community itself might be quite welcoming and supportive, those outside of the community or able-bodied persons without disabilities are often discriminatory and exclusionary. And this discrimination is systemic now, and we see it in anything from social settings, education systems, definitely the healthcare system, and the workplace as well. Now, moving on to the workplace, speaking of that, work is viewed and experienced differently by Indigenous peoples with disabilities. As Indigenous peoples, our identity is interconnected, and interconnected doesn't even seem like strong enough of a word, but I'll use it in this case. Identity is interconnected with the land, the water, our ancestors, and the Creator. Introducing ourselves in our traditional language, as I did earlier on the presentation today, honors our heritage, reflects our value, which our value is based on who we are and where we're from, rather than what we do for work. Work was not about making money or maximizing profits. It was about contributing to our communities. And the tasks we take on as Indigenous peoples are meant to honor our ancestors, support fellow community members, and benefit the next 7 generations that are to come after us. And now I do believe that the current world of work has similar values, like people work to support themselves, set their families up for success, and benefit their communities, thinking about the folks who work at a nonprofit, for example. But now 1/3 of our lives are spent working. And again, that's the 1 in 3, 1/3. It's a huge percentage. So it's no wonder that our identity today is intertwined with our careers, because our careers monopolize so much of our time. And the first question that you ask someone when you meet them is, what is your name and what do you do for work? So our value is placed on what we do, and we put value based off of people's careers. And because the modern workforce often equates work with productivity, this leads to misconceptions about Indigenous and non-Indigenous individuals with disabilities who may be viewed as less valuable if they lack conventional jobs, don't work, or have disabilities that maybe inhibit their employment. Moving on to inclusivity, from an Indigenous standpoint, no task is more important than another, and everything that was done would be considered work. And there was certainly no concept of unpaid labor. Every task that was done and is done recognized as having a meaningful purpose. We believe in a balanced approach without strict gender roles. And I'll say, although, for example, women were primarily seen as the caretakers and raising young ones, they would also hunt and gather. But today, even though it's 2025, we still see cis male dominated fields, and we still see a wage gap. Nature of work was different. It was very skills based, emphasizing individual strengths. Skills were taught by an elder or knowledge keeper or someone in the community that with the intention of passing down the knowledge to the next generation. And traditional ecological knowledge was the education necessary for survival. Now, system is standardized. You go to school, receive an education, secure a job, move up the ladder, so on and so forth. Lived experiences and acquired knowledge aren't considered job qualifications, even though they greatly benefit our workplaces. So, for example, someone who has been working in carpentry since a young age in their Indigenous community without formal schooling might miss out on a job opportunity because they aren't considered a safe hire. Lastly, previously established identity is very important for Indigenous peoples and Indigenous persons with disabilities. And I'm probably very biased in saying this, but Indigenous peoples are a very proud people. They're proud of who they are, and they certainly aren't afraid to vocalize it. But today, many Indigenous individuals may choose to conceal their identity in the workplace, just as those with invisible or episodic disabilities may do. And then for those of us who navigate both an Indigenous identity and disabilities and mental health challenges, this internal struggle surrounding the validity of our disability or indigeneity is often amplified. For visual context for this slide that I have up, there's a picture of a First Nations medicine wheel. On the right-hand side, there is a yellow quadrant with the words East and physical. There is a red quadrant on the bottom with the words South and mental. There is a black quadrant with the words West and emotional on the left-hand side. And at the top, we have a white quadrant with the words North and spiritual. So I've just described the, oh my goodness. I've just described the medicine wheel here, which is a sacred symbol for First Nations peoples. Represents the 4 directions, 4 sacred medicines, 4 stages of life, and many other cultural aspects and beliefs. And the teachings from the medicine wheel guide us. And when the quadrants are fulfilled, we live in harmony, just as the Creator wishes for us. So life ebbs and flows in a very cyclical manner. So think about the circle or the wheel. So things come and go, good days and bad days. Nothing remains constant. So thinking about episodic disabilities, marked by periods of good health, and then bad health or illness or disability, and the periods that vary in severity, duration, and from one person to the next. So through this journey, we strive to find balance in uncertainty. When one quadrant of or one portion of the medicine wheel is neglected, we become out of balance, and that is what leads to suffering. And I'm speaking traditionally speaking. Very quickly, because I know I'm running out of time here. I'll start in the East, in physically. So this encompasses being healthy within our bodies and being physically safe and sound in the environments that we inhabit. So physically within myself and my surroundings. To the south, we have mentally, which involves having mental clarity and good mental health. To the west, we have emotionally, which refers to welcoming emotions as they come and go while being able to express and experience those emotions. And then to the north, we have spiritual. And this can mean a few things. And I'd like to express it in a way that means knowing that you are not alone, that you are part of something greater, and honoring one's culture, religion, beliefs, whatever they may be. And I'm certainly not here to suggest that adopting a holistic, traditional lifestyle and these teachings is the solution. But I think by utilizing the teachings of the medicine wheel, we can incorporate Indigenous ways of knowing to improve our colonial structures related to disability and employment. So thinking in that context, when we look at the East in our physical sense, this can mean providing a physically safe and accessible work environment, along with supports throughout employment, like offering benefits that cover health-related costs, flexible working hours, and possible options for remote work. Mentally speaking, it's important to have an employer, if there are any employers on this call, that understands the fluctuation of mental health and episodic disabilities and can not only be empathetic, but provide support. So mental health days, health benefits, and a safe working environment. Emotionally, this means fostering an emotionally safe environment as well. Spiritually, holding space for spirituality through actions that welcome others with differing beliefs and creating a workspace that embraces diversity. Melissa, give me a wave if you need to cut me off.
Yeah, I think we've got about 5 minutes or so, and there are a couple of questions, or there's just one question. So yeah, carry on.
Perfect. So when considering all the information that I've shared with you today, I'd like to pose the question of how can employers create a safe environment for employee disclosure of episodic disabilities to glean understanding and provide support and accommodation. When I think about this question, and thinking about contemplating the need to disclose disabilities in the workplace, this raises another question for me. Why can't work environments already be structured for success? When I reflect back to the community that we work with as an organization, and even my own community and my own family, I realize that detailing disabilities and justifying the need for certain accommodations is very traumatizing, or it can be a traumatic experience for many individuals living with disabilities. And while I certainly advocate for self-advocacy and acknowledge that employers should inquire about the necessary accommodations for their employees, the responsibility shouldn't fall solely on the employee. Yes, individuals living with disabilities understand their needs better than anyone. But it's also essential for employers to engage in a proactive approach and apply soft accommodations right off the bat. They should invest in discovering best practices through advocates, through the disability community, through disability organizations and employment organizations who've already done the research and know where the gaps lie. So it's not like we need to reinvent the wheel. Given the rising precedence of episodic disabilities, we know that individuals choose not to disclose their conditions, leaving employers unaware of the supports and what support is needed. So it's important that employers establish themselves with a reputation as an informed and disability conscious employer. The concept of a perfect employee is a myth, and everyone, and this is certainly not to discount, but not only persons with episodic disabilities experiences fluctuations in their well-being. So it would make certainly a greater workplace for every employee, and a balanced approach. Like the medicine wheel, thinking back, an employer should prioritize the staff's mental, physical, emotional, and spiritual well-being. It's important to foster workplaces where people feel that they are safe to embrace their diversity and express their identity authentically without fear of discrimination or having their identity questioned. Very quickly, I want to pose one more question to everyone. What does indigeneity, disability, and employment have in common? And where can we find a common understanding? I would argue that within all of these realms, the intersection is that of a strong sense of community and love, be it within our cultures, within our peers, and at our workplaces. So in closing, I want to highlight the importance of community in our journey towards understanding and addressing Indigenous disability and episodic disability at work, so we can strive to break down barriers, promote inclusion, and advocate for policies that reflect the unique needs of our communities. If I don't get to answering your questions because I've been talking too much, I would encourage you to reach out to me through the mechanisms listed on the screen here. And for those listening in, my email is idcnc@bcands.bc.ca. Chimagwech, thank you very much for listening in. Thank you, Melissa.
Thank you so much, Julia. We really appreciate you sharing as always.